Have you ever been so annoyed by someone that you needed the entire world to know it, even if that someone would never actually find out? That's exactly where this story starts. A woman named Freya moves into a new apartment, excited for a fresh start. Within 2 weeks, she's living next to the single most inconsiderate human being she has ever met. And in one moment of pure, exhausted frustration, she does something small, something petty, something almost funny. She renames her Wi-Fi network after him. She thinks it's harmless, a private joke only she can see. But this one decision is about to unravel into notes taped to doors, a building-wide investigation, a secret nobody expected, and a face-to-face confrontation that changes everything. By the end of this video, you will be asking yourself the same question thousands of people asked in the comments when this story first went viral. Was she wrong? Or was she just getting started? Stick around, because this story gets a lot bigger than a Wi-Fi name. Freya was 29 years old when she signed the lease on apartment for B. It was a small building, only 6 units, tucked on a quiet-looking street with old brick walls and creaky wooden stairs. She'd been living with roommates for years, splitting rent, tiptoeing around other people's schedules, and 4B was the first place that was going to be entirely hers. She remembers standing in the empty living room on move-in day, sunlight coming through the window, and thinking, finally, peace and quiet. She didn't know yet that peace and quiet lived on the other side of a very thin wall, and that wall belonged to a man named Dominik. Dominik lived in 4R directly next door. Freya met him for the first time on her second day, when she was struggling to carry a bookshelf up the stairs alone. She hoped a neighbor might offer to help. Instead, Dominik opened his door just enough to glance at her, said nothing, and closed it again. She laughed it off. Not everyone has to be friendly, she told herself. Some people just keep to themselves. She would have been happy with that, genuinely, if Dominik had simply kept to himself. None of what happened next would have ever started. But keeping to himself was not something Dominik knew how to do. Within the first week, Freya started noticing sounds through the wall. Not occasional sounds, constant ones. Loud phone calls late at night. A television turned up so high she could make out entire conversations from the show he was watching. Doors slamming, footsteps that sounded less like walking and more like stomping. She told herself it was an adjustment period. New apartment, new sounds. She just needed time to get used to it. By the second week, she realized this wasn't something she was going to get used to. This was simply how Dominik lived. He hosted people almost every night, not wild parties. Nothing that would justify calling the police, but a steady stream of loud conversations, laughter that echoed through the walls at 1, 2, sometimes 3 in the morning, and on the nights he didn't have guests. He was on video calls, speakerphone blasting, pacing his apartment while he talked, which Freya could tell only because of how the volume of his voice rose and fell as he moved from room to room. She tried the polite route first. She knocked on his door one evening, dressed in her work clothes, exhausted after a long day, and asked, kindly, she insisted, kindly, if he could keep the noise down a little after 10. Dominik's response was short. He said he'd try. He did not try. The following night was louder than the one before. By week 3, Freya had stopped sleeping properly. She was waking up at 2 in the morning to muffled music, at 4 to the sound of his front door slamming as guests left, and getting up for work at 6 feeling like she hadn't slept at all. It wasn't just the noise either. Small things started piling up. Dominik parked his car in the spot marked for her unit twice, leaving her circling the block looking for street parking. He left his garbage bags outside his door instead of taking them to the bins, and more than once she found the hallway smelling like old food because of it. When packages were delivered to the building, hers sometimes ended up moved, shoved to the side, occasionally missing entirely, only to reappear a day later looking suspiciously like they'd been opened and taped back shut. She couldn't prove that was him, but she had a strong feeling. She started keeping a mental list, not out of any real plan, just because the frustration needed somewhere to go. Noise complaints, parking, packages, a general refusal to acknowledge her existence unless it benefited him. She tried talking to him twice more. Both times, the conversation was nearly identical. He'd nod, say something like, yeah, no worries, and change absolutely nothing about his behavior. It became clear that Dominik didn't see her as a person he needed to consider. He saw her as background noise in his own life, the same way she was forced to treat the noise coming from his apartment. One night, after a particularly rough evening of listening to what sounded like a full dinner party through the wall until nearly 1 in the morning, Freya sat on her couch with her laptop, trying to focus on a work project due the next day. Completely unable to concentrate, she opened her Wi-Fi router settings, mostly just to check if maybe a stronger signal or a different channel might somehow help her focus. Some small technical fix for a very non-technical problem. And that's when, half out of exhaustion and half out of spite, she typed a new network name into the box. She didn't overthink it. She just wanted, for one moment, to feel like she had some kind of power in this situation, even if it was symbolic. Even if no one but her would ever know. She named her Wi-Fi network after Dominik, something short, unmistakably his name, paired with a phrase that made it very clear exactly how she felt about him. She hit save, closed her laptop, and for the first time in weeks, she actually smiled a little before falling asleep. She thought it was the end of it. A private joke, visible only on her own device. Harmless and satisfying. She had no idea why Wi-Fi networks don't stay private in an apartment building, where the walls are thin, enough to hear a phone ring 3 units away. For about 2 weeks, nothing happened. Freya almost forgot about the network name entirely, aside from the small satisfaction every time she connected her phone and saw Dominik's name paired with her petty little joke sitting quietly in her settings menu. Then, one Saturday afternoon, she ran into her neighbor from Fosse, an older woman named Ingrid who had lived in the building for over a decade. Ingrid mentioned, almost as a passing comment while they waited for the elevator, that her grandson had been visiting and noticed something funny on his phone's Wi-Fi list, a network with Dominik's name on it, and in Ingrid's words, not very nice words next to it. Freya froze for a second, laughed it off as if she had no idea what Ingrid was talking about, and went back to her apartment feeling her stomach twist slightly. She had forgotten one very obvious fact. Wi-Fi networks broadcast to everyone nearby, whether or not they're connected. Anyone in the building with their phones Wi-Fi turned on could see every network name in range, which meant, this entire time, her joke hadn't been private at all. It had been sitting there, visible to the whole building, for 2 weeks. She told herself it was fine. Dominik wasn't exactly known for being observant. Maybe he'd never notice. Then came the first sign that he had. She found a note taped to her door. No greeting. No signature needed. She knew exactly who it was from. The note was short, and it made it very clear that Dominik knew about the network name, and that he did not find it funny. Freya's first reaction, if she was honest with herself later, was a strange kind of satisfaction. For weeks, she had been the only one absorbing the consequences of his behavior. Now, for the first time, he was the one reacting to something she had done. But underneath that small satisfaction was something else. A flicker of nervousness. Because if Dominik was upset enough to write and tape a note to her door, this was no longer just a private joke between her and her router settings. This was now a conflict. And conflicts, she was starting to realize, had a way of escalating far beyond where anyone intended them to go. She thought about renaming the network right then, quietly ending it before it became anything bigger. Instead, she left it exactly as it was. What followed over the next week and a half turned into something Freya, looking back, could only describe as an absurd, silent war conducted almost entirely through notes taped to doors and passive, aggressive behavior in the hallway. 2 days after the first note, Dominik began playing music loud enough that Freya was fairly certain it was intentional. Not his usual carelessness, but a direct message. She responded, not proudly, by leaving her television on with a home renovation show playing overnight, loud enough to travel through the wall in return. The parking incidents increased. Her packages started disappearing more frequently, and one afternoon she found an empty box addressed to her sitting outside near the building's trash bins, clearly opened. She started keeping records, photos of the notes, timestamps of noise, screenshots of delivery confirmations compared to when packages actually arrived, or didn't. Not because she had a specific plan yet, but because some instinct told her this situation might eventually require proof. Other residents in the building began noticing the tension. Ingrid from Fosse mentioned that Dominik had complained to her about the woman next door being petty. Freya, in turn, vented to a co-worker and close friend named San, who found the entire situation both hilarious and concerning in equal measure. You do realize, San told her over coffee one evening, that renaming your Wi-Fi wasn't really about the internet. It was the only place you felt like you had any control over him. And now that he knows, that control is gone, and you're both just going to keep escalating until something actually happens. Freya didn't want to admit Sam was right, but she knew she was. The building's property manager, A stern, no-nonsense man named Henrik eventually got involved after another resident complained about the ongoing noise war between 4A and 4B. Henrik called both Freya and Dominik in separately for what he called a friendly conversation, which really meant a formal warning that further noise complaints could affect their lease renewals. Freya sat across from Henrik, expecting to feel embarrassed. Instead, something else came up in the conversation, something she hadn't expected at all. Henrik mentioned, almost offhandedly while flipping through his notes, that Dominik's lease situation was complicated and that management was already keeping an eye on Unit 4A. For reasons unrelated to the noise complaints entirely. Freya asked what he meant. Henrik, realizing he'd said more than he should have, quickly brushed it off and moved on. But the seed was planted. There was something going on with Dominik that had nothing to do with her. Something that had apparently been happening long before she ever moved in. She left that meeting more curious than angry for the first time in weeks. It was Ingrid once again, who ended up filling in the pieces. This time over an unplanned conversation in the building's small laundry room. Ingrid explained, in the careful way older neighbors often share information they probably shouldn't, that Dominik had moved into the building almost 2 years earlier under very different circumstances than most tenants. He hadn't signed the lease alone. He'd moved in with his wife, a quiet woman named Katarina who Ingrid remembered fondly. Someone who used to bring baked goods around during the holidays. About 8 months before Freya moved in, Katarina had left. Suddenly, according to Ingrid, and not amicably, there had been shouting matches audible through these same thin walls long before Freya ever heard them. Dominik had stayed in the apartment alone since then, and according to Ingrid, he had changed considerably. Quieter at first, she said, then gradually louder, messier, more erratic, as if he was filling the silence of the empty apartment with anything he could. Loud calls, guests almost every night. Music turned up far past what was reasonable. The picture that formed in Freya's mind was suddenly a lot more complicated than annoying neighbor. It didn't excuse his behavior. It didn't make the stolen parking spot or the open packages or the months of lost sleep acceptable. But it explained something. Dominik wasn't simply a rude person who didn't care about anyone else. He was someone whose life had fallen apart in a very public, very audible way. In an apartment building where everyone could hear it happening, and he had spent the better part of a year making that pain everyone else's problem too, whether he realized it or not. There was more though, and this part came directly from Henrik a few days later, during a second, less formal conversation, when Freya stopped by the office to ask about a maintenance request. Dominik, it turned out, was significantly behind on rent. Months behind, in fact, and the complicated lease situation Henrik had alluded to earlier was actually the building quietly working through the early stages of an eviction process. The parties, the noise, the erratic behavior, all of it had been happening while Dominik was, according to Henrik, barely keeping the lights on, financially and otherwise. Freya sat with this information for a long moment after leaving the office. She thought about the Wifi name still sitting there, broadcasting his own name back at him every single day. A small cruel joke aimed at a man whose life had clearly been falling apart in ways she'd had no idea about. For the first time since this entire thing started, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel toward Dominik. She felt a flicker of guilt, but that flicker didn't erase the months of lost sleep, the missing packages, or the fact that none of this history gave him the right to treat her the way he had. Sympathy and accountability, she realized, could exist in the same place at the same time. The confrontation, when it finally happened, wasn't planned. Freya had actually decided, after learning everything from Ingrid and Henrik, that she was going to quietly change the Wifi name back to something normal and simply let the whole situation fade away. She never got the chance to do it first. She was in the hallway on a Thursday evening, arms full of groceries, when Dominik's door opened and he stepped out at the exact same moment. For the first time in the 2 months she had lived there, they were standing face to face with no wall, no note, no hallway rumor between them. He looked tired, not just annoyed tired, but the kind of tired that comes from months of things going wrong all at once. And before Freya could say anything, he spoke first. He asked her, flatly, why she thought it was okay to humiliate him in front of the entire building. Freya, groceries still in her arms, took a breath and told him the truth. She told him she'd done it out of frustration, after weeks of noise, stolen parking, and missing packages, after trying to talk to him politely more than once and being brushed off every single time. She told him it was petty, and she wasn't proud of it, but it hadn't come from nowhere. Dominik started to argue back. but something in his voice faltered halfway through. He admitted quietly that he knew he'd been loud. He knew about the parking. He said he hadn't meant for any of it to go this far, that things had been a lot lately, and he hadn't been thinking clearly about much of anything. Freya, against every instinct telling her to just end the conversation and go inside, asked him directly if everything was okay. There was a long pause in the hallway, long enough that Freya almost regretted asking. Then Dominik, in a much quieter voice than she'd ever heard from him, admitted that his wife had left, that he'd been struggling to keep up with rent, and that most nights, the noise and the guests were less about disrespecting anyone and more about not wanting to sit alone in a silent apartment that used to have someone else in it. It wasn't an excuse, and to his credit, he didn't try to frame it as one. He apologized, somewhat awkwardly, for the parking and the packages, admitting quietly that yes, it had been him moving her deliveries, out of some petty frustration of his own after the first note she'd found. Freya, for her part, apologized for the Wifi name, not for being frustrated, she told him, but for the way she chose to express it. It wasn't a warm, movie-style reconciliation. It was two exhausted people standing in a hallway, admitting they both handled things badly. Now, if this story ended right there, in the hallway, with a quiet apology, it would be a nice story, but it wouldn't be the full one, because peace between two neighbors didn't mean the building's management simply forgot everything that had happened over the past 2 months. The noise complaints were already on file. The formal warning from Henrik was already documented, and the situation with Dominik's rent, which Freya now understood far better than she wished she did, was already moving forward on its own separate track entirely, regardless of one hallway apology. Here's where the story takes its final turn. A few days after their conversation, Freya, wanting to do something to actually help rather than just feel guilty, mentioned to Dominik that Henrik had talked about a formal review of his lease. She didn't share every detail, just enough to make it clear that this was bigger than a noise complaint now. Dominik, to his credit, didn't get angry at her for knowing. Instead, he asked her, almost sheepishly, if she had any idea what he should do. Freya, who happened to know through San that the building association had a small emergency assistance fund for tenants facing temporary financial hardship, something most residents didn't even know existed, told him about it. She helped him figure out the paperwork one evening at her kitchen table, of all places, the same table where she'd once sat drafting mental complaints about him. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. There was no dramatic public exposure, no viral post naming and shaming him, nothing that satisfying in a simple way. The real revenge, if you could even call it that, was almost the opposite. It was Freya choosing not to let the situation destroy someone who was clearly already struggling, even after everything he put her through. Some viewers of this story, when it was originally shared, argued this wasn't revenge at all, that Freya was letting him off too easy. Others argued it was the most satisfying kind of ending, because it proved she was never actually a petty person to begin with. She was simply someone who had been pushed to her limit and reacted the way most exhausted, sleep-deprived humans eventually do. Whichever way you see it, the outcome was the same. Dominik applied for the assistance, caught up on part of his overdue rent, and avoided the eviction process that had already been quietly moving forward. In the weeks that followed, the building noticeably calmed down. The late-night gatherings became rare instead of constant. When Dominik did have people over, the volume stayed reasonable. Freya's packages arrived exactly where they were supposed to, every time. It wasn't a complete transformation. Dominik was still, by nature, a bit inconsiderate at times, the kind of person who occasionally forgot to bring his garbage down or left his music slightly too loud on a Friday night. But it was a different kind of inconsiderate now, ordinary neighbor-level annoying, not the constant, draining kind that had defined Freya's first 2 months in the building. Henrik, during a later conversation, actually mentioned to Freya that Dominik's rent was fully caught up, and that the lease review Freya had once worried about had quietly closed without further issue. Ingrid, always the one with the best information in the building, later told Freya that Dominik had started seeing a therapist, something Freya hadn't asked about, but was quietly glad to hear. As for the Wi-Fi network, Freya changed the name that same week, back to something forgettable, something nobody in the building would ever comment on again. When she told this story on Reddit months later, she wasn't looking for validation or revenge fantasies in the comments. She said she mostly wanted to know if she'd been wrong to do what she did in the first place. Back before she knew any of the context, the responses were split almost evenly. Some readers argued that nothing excuses months of genuine disrespect, and that Freya had every right to vent however she wanted, especially before she knew anything about Dominik's situation. Others argued that public humiliation, even accidental, is never really the answer, and that the story only ended well because Freya chose empathy after the fact, not because the original decision was a good one. So, was it wrong to name her Wi-Fi network after her annoying neighbor? Maybe the more interesting question isn't whether it was right or wrong. It's what the story became after that one small, petty decision. A silly joke turned into a note war. A note war turned into a formal warning. And a formal warning accidentally led to Freya learning something about the person next door that she never would have known otherwise. Most neighbor conflicts don't end with a hallway apology and a shared trip through paperwork at someone's kitchen table. Most of them just end in cold silence, slammed doors, or someone eventually moving out. Freya and Dominik still live next to each other today. Still neighbors. Not close friends. Not the kind of people who share dinners or borrow sugar. But two people who, at some point, saw each other honestly for the first time. Walls and Wi-Fi signals aside. If you've made it this far, let me know in the comments. Do you think Freya was wrong for what she did? Or do you think, given everything that came after, it actually turned out to be exactly what needed to happen? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe, because next week's video covers a Reddit story that might be even messier than this one. A roommate, a security deposit, and a secret nobody in the apartment saw coming. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.